Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to introduce a dear friend and mentor of mine, Telford Keogh. Catherine was born in Toronto and now currently lives and works in New York. She received an MFA in sculpture from the Yale School of Art in 2011 and an MAR in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies from Yale University in 2013. Catherine's work seeks to find connections between human and non-human matter by utilizing domestic, edible, and industrial materials. Her work has been the subject of solo exhibitions at Evans Contemporary in Peterborough, Ontario, Public Storage Building in Toronto, UWAG in Waterloo, Ontario, and most recently a show that I was thrilled to be able to see in person at Helena Anrather in New York. She is also currently working on an upcoming solo exhibition at Erin Stump Projects in Toronto that is slated to open this year. Catherine has been the recipient of many grants and awards from the Toronto Art Council, Ontario Arts Council, and Canada Council for the Arts. I met Catherine back in 2014 during my undergraduate studies at the Hartford Art School when she came and lectured alongside Leon Finley. The learning of her work came at an extremely pivotal and formative time for me. I often return to her shows, thoughts, interviews, and writings when I feel stagnant or unsure of direction because her confidence in material and form is both incredibly inspiring and contagious. Please join me in giving the warmest of welcomes to Catherine Telford Keogh.
Thank you. Audrey, thank you so much for such a generous introduction. I'm really excited to be here and speak with you, and thanks so much for inviting me. And I look forward to seeing lots of your work in the next few days. So I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm going to talk for about an hour and 10 minutes, and I actually can't see anyone, so I'm talking to a void right now. So if, Audrey, if anyone has, I don't know, questions, I guess, in the chat, then just let me know. Sorry, I'm just seeing that there we go. So my work examines how materials, images, objects, and bodies kind of interact, absorb, and contaminate and consume one another in processes that create some kind of moving assemblage. And I'm thinking of things as not these kind of closed autonomous entities, but always becoming in relation to other things. And this becoming is shaped by physical properties and systems of meaning which shape and transform when they interact with other things. And I'm also interested in the politics that might emerge through this interaction, and that the politics of that interaction, of course, is kind of grounded within an amalgam of interlocking systems like biological, capitalist systems, architectural systems, and obviously uneven power relations as well, that kind of structure and manage these kinds of intimacies. So I'm trying to kind of use material in the studio from the world around me and combine them to form assemblages that might both highlight these structures and also undo the very systems that manage objects' existence. So I want to begin with the early work from 2015, and after I did my second degree at the Divinity School, I was done with that, moved to New York, and I was working on sculpture and trying to think about how I could get sculptural materials to literally absorb one another or be in contact in a way that there was this kind of material overlap. And I found that I couldn't do this through sculpture. And because I was really thinking about this as a bodily or embodied process. So I decided that I needed to kind of use my own body in the work, which I've never done again, but this work has kind of provided a foundation through which all other work is kind of generated. So I think about this as like a generator or foundation of the work that I made after and I've been making. So this is a piece called Look Inside and You Will Find Me from 2015. And the work is a single channel video that documents Carlos Villaprado, another artist, and I repeatedly touching our pupils. So it's an act that fuses both looking and touching. And at the time, I was listening to a lot of like YouTube body scan meditation videos, both like for real and also kind of ironically. And I noticed that, body scan meditation is kind of about moving from exterior to interior through this kind of imaginative corporeal focus. So, focusing on the feet and then moving all the way to the head. And it's this language that gets kind of repeated over and over again to create some sort of like calming experience. So what I did is hired a voice actor who does meditation videos online to read a text that I wrote using that similar language. So I'll play the video and then talk a little more about it. I'll just play a clip.
Allow your muscles in your face to relax. Drop your shoulders and inhale deeply. Open yourself up to the world. Shift your consciousness to the movement of your breath, rising and falling, in and out, evenly and effortlessly. Please position yourself in a place and posture where you can comfortably feel and see from a place of security. Take note of your diaphragm. Become aware of your ribs expanding with each breath and gently contracting as you exhale. Gently bring your consciousness back to the heat of your body. Become aware of sensations of warmth in your hands and your fingers as they move up and down your thighs. Allow feeling to precede cognition. Let your muscles relax and let go of thinking. Imagine yourself radiating certainty, success, and optimism.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop the video there. So in this intimate form of looking, rather than seeing another, like, one imagines that when you get close up to observe something, it becomes more clear, you gain more information. But rather than seeing another definitely or clearly, and getting to know another through a kind of wider breadth of information, vision becomes blurred and there's this kind of messy exchange of fluids. And so again, fluids pass from one body to another. So I was thinking about this type of encounter as both kind of fostering intimacy and reception and connection, while also holding in tension the strangeness and unsettling experience of another's body, and also the parameters of one's own body. So like the strangeness of another and then the strangeness that happens within the self. So this work I felt was kind of, doing my idea, or like doing what I was aiming for rather than representing an idea. So after I was in New York, I had a work permit issue, so I had to move back to Toronto. And there I did this show that Audrey mentioned at Evans Contemporary called Source Supplements. And this included work that I mentioned earlier. I was kind of working on these sculptures in the studio and trying to figure out how material interactions could create new forms of meaning that, you know, made things mean differently than they would autonomously in this kind of assemblage. So in the exhibition, I'm thinking about the mouth as both this site of language and also the site where food gets chewed on and digested with other foods and liquids and materials. And I'm thinking about language in that way too, that it kind of takes up the mouth and is maybe stuttered or deformed in some way. And Source Supplements is a group of alliterative words that are used by a number of these nutritional or health websites. So in kind of preparation for this show, I was looking at, you know, late at night, figuring out what the work I was doing, what it meant. And I happened upon these various like vitamin or what are those called? Like super drinks, super nutrition drinks. And I found that there was this word grouping was used a lot, source supplements. And, you know, so source is this reference to some sort of foundation or origin, and then supplement is this thing that is kind of lacking or needed to kind of fill up something to create a whole. And so I was interested in the way that these corporations were positioning themselves as this facilitator of nutrition, so that, you know, this generalized body that the websites were directed towards was lacking, and the corporation is the entity that is there to kind of feed or supplement this generalized body. So in the work, the sculptures are formed and kind of filled with combined materials to form these chains of superimposed ingredients, including Del Monte sliced pickles, Hellman's light mayonnaise, and Bic still pickles, Del Monte sliced peaches. And I use industrialized food in my work because of its similarity to other parts of the body, and also its unstable physicality. And that instability is really important in the work, that the objects both look frozen and then move over time. So the excess of materials in the material list, and the material list is really important for me because I feel like it sits as a text alongside the work, and it creates this dissociative relationship where one kind of loses count of the ingredients or objects in the accumulation, in the mixture. And so things both kind of hold and lose their autonomy. And then also there's this disassociation between the kind of specific description in the material list and then what is kind of mashed together in the sculpture. And under this, in this work, I'm interested in how materials start to mimic other materials. So this yellow splooge in the middle of this work is Hellman's light mayonnaise. And then it reacts similarly to the Flex Foamit material, that orange color field there, and this green. So they kind of interact with the glass in the same way. And then also there's silicone, breast enlarging inserts on the top left of the work. And then that's kind of mimicking the form of this cast in resin of ice cube trays. So I'm interested in the intimacy of kind of geometric relationships across objects from different contexts. And in the exhibition, there was also there's these 4 floor objects, and then these open wall works that are plexiglass containers filled with dish soaps and detergents. And then they're backed with these digitally manipulated images. So this is a work titled Marlowe Opened Her Eyes and Swallowed Zane's Deep Body Smell. And here I gathered corporate logos that intended to signify community and cooperation, where kind of everyone is represented, and there's this kind of promise of the good life. And I'm really interested in the kind of optimism that is implicit in corporate language. So in this work, I digitally layer and cut and stretch images so that they lose their autonomy. And then the folder that I kind of searched for these images and collected them, the color of that folder becomes the ground of the work. And the scale of the work, it's kind of a scaled relationship to the body, and it refers to this kind of dialed up optimism of billboard advertisements. And then the color of cleaners and detergents in their kind of manufactured intensity oscillate between, in this work, a kind of recognizable cleaner and that color like Gain Ultralight, Ultra Dishwashing Liquid, original scent, and then some other kind of toxic substance. And then that becomes the filter through which one sees the image. Within the exhibition, the strong, familiar corporate scents within each open container filled the gallery space and created a sensorial context to experience and like filter the viewing of the odorless sealed floor pieces. And I'm interested in cleaners as material and plastics or some sort of divider, because there are objects and structures that promise to keep contaminants out and to solidify boundaries between self and other. And then, I'm interested in the work to kind of disrupt those boundaries. So how do I, highlight the kind of rigidity of that boundary and also undo it at the same time? So the smell of the detergents and dish soaps are emanating from these open containers, and they permeate the airflow of the space. So when you walk in the space, there's a strong smell of cleaner, but at first you can't really place that smell because they're kind of mixing together in the space. And then only when you get up close do you smell the specific manufactured scent of that dish soap or that detergent. And I was interested in kind of aligning these processes of sanitation with these, sealed objects that are filled with kind of decomposing waste and discarded food. When I was making this exhibition, I was reading Lauren Berlant's book, Cruel Optimism, and thinking about the oscillation between cruelty and optimism and how those two affects kind of play out within commodity objects and within capitalist structures. And in the book, Berlant describes cruel optimism as this kind of optimistic attachment to objects, specifically commodity objects and like capitalist ideals, as cruel because they promise some sort of attainment of identities that they propose that we kind of wish to inhabit. However, these objects and ideas often erode our very life, and there's a kind of implicit failure or embedded failure in these collections of promises and the kind of logics of these objects. And interestingly, like Lauren Berlant talks both about, a lipstick as a commodity object and what kind of promises that holds, but then also ideas like a child and the promises of a child and this hope of the future, but then the child is kind of eroding your life. So she's speaking about object design ideas. So in this piece called The Telephone Melted into a Pond of Blue Goo in Jasmine's Clammy Palm After a Caller's Obscene Message, I include these white gloved cartoon hands. And these appear in many of my works, and I got them from this discarded box of these cardboard Valentine cutouts that had these slinky hands with then these slinky arms with these cartoon hands at the end. And researching more about this image, I found that it was actually directly based on minstrel performances from the 1930s and the white gloves worn in those performances. And so the history of this image is then elided, and it's circulated. It's elided through this kind of circulation and repetition in ways that make it mean differently and normalize its history. So I'm also in my work using like medical gloves because they create this hygienic barrier between self and other, or they propose that as objects, or white gloves that signal some kind of like middle class respectability. So in this work, I position the hands statically, and they're pushing against, or imagine them being kind of pushing against the glass, confronting the viewer in ways that are both kind of recognizable, but also made strange in relation to this new assemblage of commodity objects and consumer waste. And I'm trying to hold this history of this image and its kind of newly formed language of optimism or playfulness, which is kind of dark, and then with this kind of collection of waste. So in this work and in many of the works in the exhibition, I use words and letters from corporate logos, which are present, again, in all of the works, and they're broken down and fragmented. So the emphatic italics of corporate branding evoke this kind of dialed up happiness. And I'm thinking about, when I look at these logos, I think about this kind of overzealous commercial or like ad for detergents or other objects that the advertisement is selling. So here, I'm using corporate logos and then breaking them apart. So instead of reading as a word, they read as these guttural sounds like wah or ah, like in the other sculpture. So I deconstruct slanted typeface from logos such as Always Pads and Heinz Ketchup in this work, and then laminate them on top of the kind of prodigious list of materials that are found within the sculpture. And the oblique orientation of the text, I'm interested in italics kind of formally and spatially because they deny a kind of verticality and press downward, like the horizontal sculptures. And so I use language as a material and logos as a material because I'm interested in the ways that they form our understanding of objects. And then I use corporate logos and trademarks as part of titles and material lists because they're directly connected to how one experiences objects in the world within a kind of capitalist structure. So for example, our perception of Windex as an object is a combination of its logo, its branding, what it smells like, its color, where it's found, how it's used, its history, etc. And so I'm trying to like pull those elements of an object apart and then make them mean differently as these elements interact with other objects. So this work was in the back of the gallery, and it's actually the first work I made for the exhibition, and I made a series of them. And so this is a vacuum sealed honeydew bag that I fill with liquid and then drape over the image. And I'm always trying to figure out how to make images live or lively or material. And then the sealed bag also contains not only Mr. Clean, but dirt from outside of the gallery space. So I was interested in this kind of unexpected chemical reaction between the dirt and the Mr. Clean, which completely changed its color. And then the image on the wall is this white male passing hand holding dirt from within this kind of generalized landscape that is then perforated with corporate logos and images. And I've noticed that there are so many versions of this kind of image, this kind of male hand holding dirt. And so I was thinking about it and thinking that it kind of speaks to the desire for this image, and then also narratives that are already existing about, human relationships to land and kind of domination of land. And I'm interested in using stock images because they circulate and crop up in different contexts. They frame, and then that context frames the image differently. So there are these kind of default images that provide a set of options for how things are represented. And then I think that this, so they're also really specific and also really vague at the same time. And the image kind of proposes this neutrality or centers a neutrality, and that these images kind of exist in a vacuum. Yet, of course, nothing is neutral. And so I want to use these kinds of images because they center whiteness, masculinist positionings, middle class and heteronormative subject positions. And then I want to kind of take those aesthetics and manipulate them to make them mean differently. So the next two sculptures I'll talk about, I was thinking more, instead of this kind of splooge of material under glass, I was thinking more about space-saving containers and how these compartments or containers could be disrupted. So though this sculpture gives an illusion of depth, they're actually quite shallow. The work is made by creating a mold and then placing bowls and containers inside the mold, and then I pour this Flex Foamate 3 material, and then it expands 15 times its size. And then I peel the this kind of cast out of the mold, and then take some of the containers out, and then put nesting objects inside different compartments. And I'm interested again in how the big still pickles in this object fit into hot dog containers, or other objects fit into other compartments that maybe they weren't meant for. So there's this kind of intimacy of geometry here. I then pour a thin layer of resin on mostly found pieces of glass. And then when it becomes sticky, I flip it over and then kind of smush it with my body onto the cast that holds all of the objects, and then flip it over again and sit on it and kind of stand on it, so to create some sort of impact and pressure. So these works are not just about the interaction of heterogeneous materials, but also the design of containment and enclosure. So the things that we put other things into, the systems that seemingly order accumulation and our own bodily functions. And through this kind of force and pressure of making, objects slip out and deform their containment and move outside of their proper place. When I was making this work, I was reading, I first came across this book by Henry Kellogg who's the owner of Kellogg's, the cereal manufacturer. And he wrote this book called Itinerary for a Breakfast. And in the book, he was using the language of speed and efficiency and streamlined design to talk about the smooth flow of food from inside the body. And he was mostly thinking about like the esophagus or the digestive system. And he was also using a lot of kind of racialized language and really kind of racist language to equate, that some bodies could digest food better than others because they had a more efficient biological system. And, really he was talking about, especially at the time during the interwar period, the influx of immigrants and migrants, and that, their bodies were deficient in some way. So I'm researching then more about this book, and I came across a book called Eugenic Design by Christina Kogel. And in that book, she investigates the enmeshed histories of streamlined design and technology and the eugenics movement in America, and then these figurations of the body as this efficient or deficient machine. And she's thinking about she's writing about this in the 1930s, or she's speaking to that time period. And so she was interested in exploring or parsing out the ways in which this racist language figured into like immigration policy at the time, and also like more popular spaces like Vogue magazine. And so, so the language of streamlining of objects was used to speak about, for example, like models' bodies in Vogue magazine. And so I'm interested in streamlining because it's in design, because it addresses this history directly, both of the body and modernity, but also has this like racist history that doesn't come to the fore when we look at the object. So streamlining design is kind of epitomized by this rounded edge. So if you remember when cars were kind of more boxed and then they became round, that is part of streamlined design, and the mold then is rounded instead of square to kind of save on material and also to promote kind of smooth airflow in space. And this idea of smooth flow, or the language of smooth flow, was used a lot in writings on streamlined design. And so I'm thinking about the relation between the machine and the body and the kind of politics that emerge when thinking about those terms in the language of design. So this history is embedded in the streamlined object. So it has this kind of residue of the history. And in my work, the borders of objects are confused and disrupted and penetrated by the very thing made to kind of maintain, clean, or nourish the body. So the deformation of these containers becomes really important through the kind of process of making. And I use industrialized food in my work because it's part of this mass manufacturing process, similar to commodity objects. Instead of food being positioned as something kind of organic, I'm interested in the ways it's actually, synthetic or manufactured, similar to the way other objects are manufactured. And again, these foods have a direct relationship to the body and consumption and the blurring of boundaries between inside and outside. And I use plastic wrappers and containers and structures to engage ideas of consumption within consumer desire for objects that are supposed to kind of separate touch or contamination and create a barrier between self and other, or human and non-human. And position like the thing inside the container as being clean, and then everything outside is being contaminated. So again, contamination threatens this notion of a perceived self, and thinking about taking the other into the self, subject into object. So in this assemblage, the materiality of industrialized food is placed in proximity to containers to create this kind of rhyming rhythm. So in the image right in the middle is pellets of extra sugar-free gum, and it becomes like a smaller version of the white containers on the top kind of right of the image here. And so through these formal kind of rhymings or repetitions, I see that this as kind of collapsing the two objects together. And it also points to the way that form travels through repetition with slight variation, and also the kind of material closeness of industrialized food to the containers that are meant to house them, and blurring the boundaries between what is considered edible and toxic. So I was thinking a lot about, in making that work, I was thinking more about structures versus, just materials. And so in my exhibition, Dental Dam, I started to think more about how bodies interfaced with forms and objects and aesthetic architecture in, public institutional spaces like hospitals or dental offices, walk-in clinics, sexual health clinics, and educational institutions. And I grew up in my formative years when I was living in Toronto, helping my dad, who's a chiropractor, in his office. And I think that the aesthetic of that space really had an impression on me. And I was, in his office, there are these kind of diagrams, labeled diagrams of both the skeletal and exterior of the body. And I watched him kind of manipulate the exterior of the body to change something in the interior. And so I'm really interested in that, like, I don't know, scale shift, or how can I manipulate something from the outside to change its interior composition? And then how is exterior and interior actually maybe a fold or the same thing? So before as I'm kind of making the work for the exhibition and figuring out what it's going to be, I was visiting my grandfather in this palliative care facility, and then and it was close to the college where I was teaching at the time. And for some reason, the cafeteria at this college had this skid of Monster drinks, so it was a huge skid. And after buying 5, you could win these gamer chairs, and the gamer chairs were kind of lined up in this cafeteria in a row, and it was all the same gamer chair. And there was something really strange about that image within a cafeteria or eating space. So moving between these 2 spaces, so I would go and visit my grandfather in between class, and I started to think about both of these spaces as kind of these variations of each other. I started to see the kind of gamer chairs and then the medical chairs at the palliative care facility to be like alternative versions of each other, both using some form of streamlined design to prop the body up for different procedures and functions. Also, in both of these spaces, the smell of cleaners was quite strong. So in the palliative care facility, the smell of urine was, quite palpable and mixed with some sort of cleaner, this really strong cleaner that they were using. So those 2 like bodily fluids and then this cleaner mixed together to create this other smell. So I was really interested in the ways in which, Mr. Clean or whatever cleaner they used was trying to erase the urine, but the urine could not be erased. And so instead there was this mixing that happened. And then in the school, they used this like heavy lavender scent cleaner. And then, I had to eat my lunch in the cafeteria, which was like this really dark space. And so I would smell the cooking of food and this like lavender cleaner at the same time as I was eating. So this, so I'm observing what's around me and, taking account of how the body interfaces with those spaces. So then when I was making this exhibition, I started to think about how institutional spaces were these enclosures that managed human, bacterial, and food systems through these really similar industrial structures, materials, and technologies. And I was particularly interested in the kind of uncanny moments where these structures didn't work, or something else happened that wasn't what the institution intended, or like how the institution's materials were supposed to function. So the body kind of disrupted that function. So in the exhibition, I reupholstered these gamer chairs that I found outside my studio in this reused leather, and then set them into these 2-set custom steel shelving units, almost like cubicles, or I was thinking about those kinds of spaces. And then there are 3 sculptures that are similar to the works I showed earlier, but they're, wrapped in this food grade steel. And then there's 2 mounted wall works in the exhibition that function as these diagrammic or instructional medical images. And then mounted on the back of the exhibition is a plexiglass container filled with vitamin water, and then backed with this stock image of a conventional sunset. And it's perforated with tiny images and logos from private healthcare and kind of medical websites. And like the show source supplements, I'm using another alliterative word grouping. And so dental dam, which is the name of the exhibition, is a thin film of latex used to isolate the tooth during kind of medical procedures, dental procedures specifically. And then it's also used as kind of protection during cunnilingus or oral sex. And so I'm thinking about linking the mouth with the lower regions of the body, and thinking about how these practices or materials that practice hygiene as a surface, and the systems of organization that they exist in are kind of making contact with sexuality and parts of the body that expel waste. So this is a work titled X Autopoiesis Secret Lab Titan 5172601. And in this work, the body is kind of evoked by this tilted gamer chair, and it's set between this like food trolley, surgical supply cart, gurney, or some sort of dental system, like a furniture set that you would maybe buy from IKEA. And the chair is tilted upward to kind of give access as an apparatus that kind of gives access to the body. And then the shelving is inset in the shelving unit is these slabs that I found that was these people were getting rid of after updating their kitchen. So they're from the 1980s. And, you know, obviously I was interested in them being as like slabs of flesh or slabs of fat that could be both like animal or human. And then within this two set structure, there was also these bowls filled with different materials like Nature's Path, Kia Superfood. And the title of these works and the rest of the works in the exhibition are taken from the language of the premier gamer chair called Secret Lab, that company. And I found that many of these gamer chairs were named after Greek gods, and then always had these X's associated with the titles of the different objects that Secret Lab was selling. And I thought about that as this kind of like triple X, or X being this letter that evokes some sort of speed, or some sort of like, I don't know, like not violence, but speed of movement and maybe force. So then, and it also, I was interested in the ways that these Greek god titles position these objects as being from some sort of like Western masculine identified positioning. So then I tried to use those titles within the exhibition and kind of reform them to make them mean differently. So during the installation of the show, I was commuting from Toronto, where I was living at the time, to Waterloo to work on the exhibition. And I would pass by this corporation called Sage Industries, and I kind of just was maybe attracted to that logo or the brand of the company, and finally I thought I would kind of go in and figure out what they made there. So I had a little bit of time. And so I realized that they were actually a dental manufacturing company. And so when I stopped in, the receptionist for some reason was really, they weren't really busy. And I think that they were quite open to maybe giving me a tour of the facility. So I saw all these kind of machines that they were making and these materials that they had. And in the back of my mind, I was kind of hoping they had some sort of refuse that they could give me that I might use. But they introduced me to this material called BioPure, which they patented, and it's a proprietary microbial mix of bacteria and enzymes that is actually used to digest organic matter in dental evacuation lines. And in talking with them, I realized that the bacterial mixture also had the capacity to eat motor oil. So this is something that really interested me because it was, you know, maybe performing an action that it wasn't supposed to perform, and with a material that was kind of outside of its context. So they gave me a 2-gallon bucket to kind of play with, that they said was expired, but the bacteria and enzymes were still functioning, still alive. So in this work, there is a cafeteria tray that I got from the school that I was working at, and I poured this hot water to activate the BioPure mixture, and then motor oil. And then over the course of the exhibition, the bacteria kind of eats the motor oil. And so that's the kind of condensation that you're seeing. This was in the kind of last days of the show. So I was interested in bringing this like eating relationship between human waste and then industrial material waste, so like oil spills or some sort of industrial process, bringing those two things together. And seeing the liquid in these trays change over time made me think more about the commingling of matter at a micro scale, because I've been kind of working with things that I could manipulate with my hands, but then there were also all these processes that happened within those larger processes that I couldn't manipulate with my hand, but were kind of just happening. So I became really interested in bacteria as this entity that that kind of moves across time-space scales, the effects of bacterial bacteria eating a material has a kind of ecological effect that is both like present and then has maybe unknown long-term impacts. And that's something I'm exploring in my work now. So this is a piece called Tentaculum Dental Dam, a GAP Pro series. And here stock images are laminated to layers of mint green plexiglass. And most of the plastic that I use in my work and these kind of cutouts comes from offcuts from a sign company in Toronto called UB Signs. And so they let me kind of root through their dumpster once in a while. And this is how I kind of get all of these texts. And I'm interested in like using the refuse of some sort of capitalist mechanism and kind of then repurposing that in the work. So I incorporate the kind of mistakes of the offcuts that UB Sign made when they were maybe making something for some corporation. And then I also add deformed logos from medical, public and then private insurance companies. And then the Humana logo, which is a private insurance company, is then kind of oriented on the image almost like clenched teeth. And so I wanted to manipulate the logo to make it look like, I don't know, it was some sort of bodily form. And I liked Humana as this logo because it's both humanizing itself, but then it feels kind of, has this like dark undertone. So the dispersed cutouts of logos are then interrupted again by this photograph of my tongue, a kind of micro, using a micro lens to get to the kind of details of my tongue, and it's saturated in saliva. And so I'm interested in the kind of image of this, you know, generalized body and then the kind of particularity, but also generalization of my own body that mirrors how medical images are produced and found like in textbooks or in diagrams within a medical office or hospital. And then here my tongue kind of interrupts the Humana logo. So it's like these clenched teeth and then also the interior of the mouth. So I was interested in this idea of this like Humana as this generalized body, and then the particularity of my body that's then generalized again through this fragmentation of the gaze of the camera. So this is a work called XXX Purities, and I always gobble that up in my mouth, total imminence. And it's a sunset that is a stock image that I got, and it's riddled with logos from, again, private and public health and medical websites. And then it's laminated against this plexiglass container, similar to the work in the previous exhibition. And I'm interested in stock images, the way that they frame nature as this thing that's completely separate from human interaction or human impact. It's almost like this fantasy space that is then ripe for domestication and projection. And so, you know, and I found that these images kind of populate institutional spaces, like when you're in the dental chair and you look up and there's like an image of a sky. So I was interested in the interaction between the corporate language of the institutional space and then the way that that institution frames nature through stock images. So then in this work, I poured this kind of cocktail of vitamin water and lemon squeeze scent, which is like the liquid that comes in that lemon, imitation lemon bottle, through the open container. And that's the cloudy mixture that you see at the bottom. And I liked this, when I saw this product, I liked the kind of semi-opacity of the material and how it kind of both related to like bodily fluid or saliva or polluted water, yet also smelled like the sweetness of its, you know, industrial manufactured smell. So there was like this tension between maybe bodily fluid and then this manufactured scent. And then over the times, like an iPhone photo of mine, over the time of the exhibition, their mold started to form, this white mold. And I was interested, it was not something I had anticipated, but immediately I was interested in the ways in which the the structure of this mold that came from tiny spores within the gallery space like mirrored in some way the way that the images were positioned within this skyscape. So there's this like collapse between this biological system that is, you know, that happens without my intention, and then these kind of the circulation of images within this digital space that then I've kind of taken and then placed almost like a messy desktop screensaver. And then this is just a detail so you can see these kind of micro images. And I wanted to have that kind of scale shift between the image of the sky as being vast and untouched, and then the language of these corporate logos that almost reveals the structures that where the sunset gets kind of situated. The title for the floor works in the show are all Nutrient Pool Threat Stimulator X. And these are made similar to the other objects, but I wanted to kind of scale them down so that they operated not like operated in relation to the space, not as furniture, but maybe as some sort of bowl, like an uncanny scale of a bowl. And they're made similar, again, to the other objects. And then but what is different is that I cut, so these are found pieces of glass. And so I cut them into a circle and then penetrate with a drill holes to create some sort of airflow so that they're no longer sealed, but rather open. And then a steel ball and chain that, you know, which is like an object that could be found to hold a plug in a bathtub, or a, you know, bank teller's office, or a pen at a bank, or sorry, a doctor's office or a pen at a bank. And I was interested in the ways in which this both like held an object in place so it couldn't be stolen or moved, but then here it's kind of used to trace a line or tether the inside of the object to the outside. And it's all movable, so there is no like it doesn't have grounding, but rather it's like flexible in its positioning. So at the time I was, you know, in like thinking about this show, I was reading a lot of Donna Haraway and interested in her idea of contact zones. And a contact zone is a space in which subjects are and things are like entities are co-constituted in their messy relations to others. And Donna Haraway frames this relation in terms of consumption or digestion. And she talks about what she calls in-digestion, and that being, you know, she's talking about bacteria and kind of smaller, what she calls small critters, but that the critter, you know, eats the thing, and then there's something always remaining, and then that remaining thing gets kind of transformed over time as these relations continue, and things, you know, keep eating other things, and then the remainder of the previous thing, you know, kind of stays. But there's some sort of metamorphosis and autonomy and also consumption. So in these works, consumer waste is mixed with over-the-top medications like Advil Extra Strength and liquid gels, which I started to use in other works after this exhibition, and industrialized food, and these bowls that I got from the cafeteria at the school that I worked at, and then also other found objects that signaled some sort of container. And at the time I was working a number of part-time jobs and drinking a lot of Monster drink, probably because I was in that cafeteria a lot, and then also taking a lot of Advil to like stay awake and be present. And so they just kind of migrated into the work, but they made me think about like what foods are maybe necessary to, I don't know, be present in a system that seeks to exhaust one's labor or exhaust the body. And so then you need all of these other kind of supplements so that you can kind of keep being like a productive citizen, a good productive citizen. So these medications then made their way into the work. And then nearing the end of the show, I met physicist, Andrew Pelling, and he was giving a talk at OCAD University, where I worked, about his research. And he runs a lab called the Pelling Lab for Augmented Biology, or the Pelling Lab for Biophysical Manipulation. It kind of goes by those two titles. And this is at the University of Ottawa. And there, the lab and his research is interested in stimulating cell growth through non-chemical means, and then stimulating that growth so that DNA will grow in biological materials. This is their language. So here is an example of, this is a decellularized apple. And then, they carved it out into an ear, and then living mouse DNA, living mouse skin cells are growing and active within this decellularized apple. So part of the lab's, goal or mission is to make these structures that can then be inserted into the body without using plastics. But another experiment that Andrew Pelling did is he grew these same living mouse cells on a piece of Lego. So, the lab has its own goals and, does what it does. But what I was interested in is this kind of micro scale interaction between an object and a material, in ways that, the object was this stagnant thing, and then this bacteria or cells were then taking it over. And so there was this like blurring between human and non-human matter, animal and non-human matter, and then like blurring the boundaries between things, which is something that I'm always really interested in, because of, I think it speaks to the ways that we're interconnected with everything else, like even just through, me being connected to my, computer, this camera, the water next to me. So everything is kind of existing in this kind of assemblage. And, I'm interested in scientific methodologies because of their foundational connection to probing and exploring the qualities and capacities of matter at different scales. And so there's this capacity in the lab to explore something at a micro level that could not be seen, or a molecular level that can't be seen with the human eye. So I'm really interested in that shift in scale in material relations. And I also, I'm just going to take a little sip of water. I also, when I was like from about grade maybe 2 to 8, I attended this evangelical fundamentalist Christian school and it was like a school that was attached to this tabernacle, to the church. And there, science was like not a thing. And, it was a place that I think my parents sent me to because it was cheap, because I had these behavioral and learning problems. And so there, people spoke in tongues, and, thought that the world was 6,000 years old. And so I became really interested in science as a way to kind of explain being that was counter to what I was being taught at this school. And I was, I'm interested in science in this kind of self-directed way versus, being a scientist. So when I originally wrote the grant to kind of work in this lab and explore interactions between DNA and inanimate objects or food, I wanted to examine the American type Cultural Collection Corporation. And that's a kind of biomedical a house for biomaterials that houses DNA and organizes it according to categories of race, age, disease, and sex, in this kind of searchable product catalog. And so I was interested in that form and how this corporate entity dealt with like human beings or human material and animal material. And again, like oscillating between like the optimism of science and then the cruelty of its practices. So only recently in 2018 have revisions to what's called the common law required scientists to obtain consent from people before collecting their DNA. So obviously there's that famous example of Henrietta Lacks's cells that were collected without her consent, which was the first immortalized cell line, the HeLa cell line. So though recently the common law allowed, or scientists had to kind of ask for consent, it also did not cover privately funded institutions. And it also brings up the kind of murkiness of consent within that context. And so, when I began a residency at the Pelling Lab, at the University of Ottawa, in 2018, I started to grow MCF7 human cells, which are these breast cancer cells. And they were originally from a nun Caucasian nun who passed away from breast cancer. And then I transfected those cells into jellyfish proteins and then grew those cells in decellularized scaffolds of Kroger apples and cantaloupe. And I started this process because this is kind of what the lab did, but quickly I realized that this was actually, I was like, who am I to be using someone's genetic or DNA material and then in my work? Like, that just sounds horrible. And that's not something I'm interested ethically in exploring or kind of replicating in the work. So then, these ethical questions regarding consent and then the history of scientific exploration of bodies, specifically people of color, specifically women of color, turned me away from using human or animal DNA. But I was still really interested in this kind of micro scale interaction of that was the kind of residue of properties of things. And so I started looking at viruses and bacteria, specifically non-life-threatening viruses, which then took me to start researching STDs and then herpes, specifically the genital wart strain. Oh, and this is the process of decellularizing a cantaloupe. And it's actually quite similar to how one would wash clothing. You submerge it in this bleaching liquid, and then it gets kind of shaken in this other machine, and then it removes the cantaloupe cells from the cantaloupe. So you're just left with this, with the structure. So I started working with HPV genital wart cell lines. So this is an image of me kind of growing up the purified DNA plasma, and from this kind of smaller container to a larger container. And it uses this liquid, that red liquid medium that you can see in the image, to grow up the cells. And you actually use a coli as the mechanism to grow material, to grow the cells. So this material research in the lab informed the most recent show that I did at Helena Anrather called Nervous System. And this show explores the entanglements of bodies and matter within technological and biological and socially networked systems. So I'm thinking less about specific systems and more about these kind of generalized interlocking systems. So each autonomous sculpture is made of linguistic, physical, and metaphorical information. And the works are contained, yet always in the process of breaking down or regenerating, pushing against a kind of bounded structure through smell, openings, holes, and vents. The typeface that coils around the combined materials spells out alliterative associations between these three words that I use to make the text, which is community, commune, and cannibalism. And I was interested in these words because they propose a non-autonomous way of being in these different contexts. And then I kind of combined them together and then deformed them within Adobe Illustrator, and then printed them out on a CNC, and then kind of layered them to create the form. And so here I'm interested in really kind of filling language with material, or making language material. And the materials in these forms recall like puddles. I was looking at a lot of puddles, or what collects at the bottom of the sink, or the objects and plastics that float or sink to the bottom of our waterways. And the title of all of the floor works is Low Life. And low life as a word, I was interested in it because it signals being kind of outside a community, but also it's like the space that, like, lowness is the space where waste collects at the side of the road, or where composting happens. And then, you know, some sort of alternative knowledge can be, because it's kind of on the sidelines or the periphery. So some sort of alternative knowledge making could potentially happen. So in the work, the plastic endures as the, and bowls and structures endure as the biomaterials start to kind of decompose and evaporate. In this work, I'm interested in how the containers, again, are kind of structuring or filing materials in ways that speak to how these materials, or how living or life systems are ordered, and how the physicality of these ordered systems almost sometimes replicate biological systems. So there's this collapse of this exterior structure of order that regulates eating and living, and then the order of the body. And I'm trying to kind of mix those two things together in the work. And these open fluorescent, like, straws or tubes, I use them to perforate the surface of the object to, again, create holes or air. And then the HPV genital wart cell line is purified, and it's embedded in this Kroger apple structure. And then it's a liquid medium is used to feed those the virus over time, but then it evaporates into the space. And I was thinking about this evaporation, excuse me, as a form of like exposure, or another kind of contact zone that collapses the erotic, I don't know, contact zone in which, like, the viewer is exposed to this foreign material, and that is also kind of living in the body. So so HPV is this foreign virus that lives within the body, and is foreign to the body, but is encompassed in the body. So as the work kind of evaporates, the materials in the assemblage kind of leave the assemblage and then, you know, enter them in different ways because they're replenished over time. And this is an image of me kind of growing up the HPV cell line within Kroger apple scaffolds, and this is in a fridge at the lab. So this is a work called Low Life Eclectic Energies. And in the work, this amber-hued resin kind of filters how objects are seen. And I was thinking about, I was looking at this cup of Diet Coke and seeing how, you know, in the sink, and seeing how it kind of transformed or filtered the objects at the bottom of the sink. So that's kind of where the image of this work came from. And each of the titles in the work they use the product categories, or the product descriptions of the color that is used to polycoat each object. And then Advil is added to each of the works to point to what's kind of needed to maybe live within this system that I'm creating in the show, and then also points to how things act on us and act inside of us. The repeated line of Bill's Big Still pickles are kind of huddled together in the plastic hot dog container here. And the curve of one pickle nestles into the, like, indent of another, and then some are autonomous. So I'm interested in this, like, creating this community of pickles. And I like pickles because, and I keep using them because of their reptilian quality, while also kind of mirroring or referencing appendages of the body. And then I set this Mars bar into the hot dog containers that hold the pickles, because, like, maybe as a humorous foil, but also, like, I like the Mars bar because it, you know, there's a scale shift between this like a packaged idea of what Mars, the terrain of Mars might be, because the terrain of Mars is supposed to be kind of mirrored in the chocolate bar. So I'm interested in that, I don't know, collapsing of those two two spaces. So then this work was also in the exhibition, and it's titled Infinite Dreamscape with Paraphernalia Corroded and Distilled Gracefully. And it holds palm olive essential dishwashing liquid, and it's backed again with a digital image. And the sunset is littered with these minuscule logos of companies connected to Imperial Oil, which is now ExxonMobil Oil, and then the most circulated memes from 2020. And at the bottom is this stretched, deformed octopus, which was used in a political cartoon to reference the stretch of Imperial Oil as this conglomerate corporation. And then I was also thinking about Donna Haraway's idea of tentacular thinking. And then in the exhibition, I was using motor oil from ExxonMobil motor oil, and the scent from the palm olive cleaner in the container was started to kind of mix with the motor oil over time in the exhibition space. And that's a detail. So the last two works were these two gamer chairs, and they're deconstructed and then reconfigured within this new kind of structure. And within each of the inset spaces within these shelves were BioPure, and then again motor oil, and then gasoline. And so the enzyme bacterial mixture is kind of eating the motor oil over the course of the exhibition. And then there's these holes or vents that the smell or the digestive processes could emit. And I was interested in the gamer chairs because of their kind of streamlined function, the way that they reference like luxury and the contemporary, and also, you know, I wanted to use them as these static follies in the space that were almost like waiting room chairs, frozen in time, staring off into space. And then the only thing that was active was this non-human digestive process. So this is a work in which, you know, I was thinking about, in the making of both of these works, I'm thinking about the kind of, I bought these gamer chairs from Wayfair.com, and I was reading the product descriptions, and they were all about kind of speed. So like maximum rotation was one of them. And so, you know, so I layered this piece of steel over these Formica like desks / countertops, and deconstructing the descriptions for these chairs. So maximum rotation becomes maxi-mum rotation. And so again, I'm trying to kind of create these this kind of stuttering language that deconstructs how corporations or stores talk about commodity objects. So that's maybe a summary or an overview of my work, and I look forward to questions from you guys.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was great.
Thanks for hosting, Audrey.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.